Hi again, it's Heather. I've got a special interview for you today. Thorn Mooney is a magical practitioner, witch, and author. She's also an academic and religious studies PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill. And I did a YouTube interview with her on August 15th. Thorn has a new book coming out. It's called Witches Among Us, and it's geared towards non-practitioners. We talked a little bit about some of the ideas in the book, about witchcraft, identities, and how to talk about magic. You can hear the whole interview at youtube.com/Heather Freeman. In this excerpt, I started by asking her to tell me about common misconceptions about people who identify as witches.
In academic spaces, you might have heard of the marginalization thesis, which is this idea in magic that people who are drawn to magic are people who exist in deviant spaces. And they do magic because they don't have access to more conventional means of power. So, because they're marginalized, they can't participate in the mainstream stuff, right? Religion or science or something like that. So they have to go do this deviant thing, magic. And what's interesting is when sociologists and ethnographers have gotten out into the field and they've actually hung out in these spaces, they've actually found the opposite. So, like, I'm researching paranormal communities right now for my own work. And what's really interesting is that by and large, people in the United States who hold paranormal beliefs are not marginalized at all. They tend to be highly educated, they tend to be comparatively affluent, and the same things are true in a lot of magical communities. And that is bewildering to people. When you meet somebody, I don't know why you would meet somebody at the grocery store telling you that they're a witch, but hang with me for a second.
Yeah.
When you meet somebody at the grocery store who says that they're a witch, most people's first thought is, "Oh God, what's wrong with them?" Maybe that's not my first thought. That's probably not your first thought. But we have this idea that they've got to be crazy, or they've got to be uneducated, or they've got to be like mentally ill, right? And we've got all these kinds of pejoratives that we throw at people. But when you actually get into these spaces and in these communities, um, that stuff ends up really not being true at all when we're looking at the collective. Those are some of the bigger misconceptions that people are facing by and large. There's still people running around, I think, who are worried about witches being evil, right? Magic being evil. The devil is still a thing. I'm in the American Southeast. We've got a big evangelical population here. We've got a growing Catholic population here. But in my day to day, especially in academic spaces, mostly people just think that I'm flaky or I must be like intellectually like compromised somehow. So,
The flip side of that is I'll be on these Discord servers, occult or esoteric Discord servers. And every couple of months, pretty regularly, conversations come up about like, how do you define what a witch even is?
I had to think about this for a long time. In my previous books, particularly in The Witch's Path, which was written as a practitioner to other practitioners, I defined a witch as a particular kind of magic worker who was invested in. I had like four criteria, and I'm going to butcher it because I haven't read my own book in a while. But I looked at relationships in spirit realms, and I defined the term spirit really broadly because there are witches out there who think they're not necessarily into like spirit realms, but they think of their own like higher self or spirit as being a thing that they have relationships with. So I was being really broad and generous there. But fundamentally, I was thinking about magic users who are moving in these other kinds of magical spaces. And the critical thing that I really harp on in this new book, because I'm not writing with my practitioner hat on necessarily. And the thing that I think a lot of folks don't get about scholarship is that scholars aren't police necessarily. If I'm doing ethnographic work on witches, which I've never done, but if I were, and I put out some kind of call, maybe I have a survey, or if I'm looking at internet forums, whatever it is, I don't get to actually be like, oop, not you. I know you
Right.
filled out my form, but I actually don't think you're a witch. So I'm not going to include you in my study. Like, we don't get to do that.
Yeah.
At least not if we're doing, I think, particularly effective scholarship. So the big criteria in this book is self-identification. This is the person at the grocery store. Again, why are you talking about witches at the grocery store? I don't know, Heather. That's weird. But if somebody tells you that they are a witch, if you go to a party or something, or you're reading a book, what are they likely to mean? And I decided to organize it in such a way where I thought about these witches in terms of categories. So when you meet somebody who tells you that they're a witch, there's a decent chance that they're using it in a religious sense. So, like, if you encounter somebody who maybe has a Wiccan background, or maybe these are those neo pagan witch folks who my professors were talking about when they're talking about Starhawk, right? They see witchcraft as being a particular religious expression. So, there's this group, and we could talk, that could be its own book and is its own myriad books written by other scholars. But then we also have this phenomenon that's coming more and more to the fore of the person who says that no, witchcraft is a secular practice. It's a trade. It's a thing that you do. It's a skill set. And those people might mean something very different. They're talking about a particular kind of like practical magic. But then you're also going to encounter people who see witchcraft as a fundamental kind of identity, who, like, I was born into a witch family, or I have innate psychic powers. I was born a witch and then I discovered being a witch. Those people may or may not see what they're doing as religious, but they see it as somehow being inborn. They might use the language of ancestry or blood. In some witch communities, you'll hear people talk about having witch blood. And like those people are out there too, so they get to be included. And then there's a fourth group that I identified, and these are the folks who see witchcraft as being fundamentally a kind of claimed identity.
Hmm.
These are the folks who are wearing the shirts that say things like, "We're the granddaughters of the witches you couldn't burn." Where, like, they might be other kinds of witches as well, but for a lot of these sorts of folks, witchcraft is tied up innately in a particular statement about identity. And it's often feminist, but not always. It's often queer, but not always. Sometimes it's ancestral, right? Sometimes it's very political. This idea that, like, there's a little witch in every woman, right? Do you remember those bumper
Right.
stickers? That's this idea where a witch is just, this is a woman in total control of herself, right?
Right.
Remember those?
Yeah.
And often in that fourth category, we're talking about folks who are thinking about witchcraft, maybe politically, but maybe also therapeutically. On TikTok, you might hear the phrase spicy psychology, right? It's about adopting a particular way of thinking, and it's very reminiscent of like New Thought and some of the ideas we get through Theosophy. But all of these are different ways in which people define their witchcraft. So I set it up in such a way that I'm talking about these groups really broadly, with the understanding that most witches aren't going to fit cleanly into one of
Right.
those, right? So,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
these boundaries are useful until they aren't.
Hmm. Gosh, yeah, no, I love that. And like that question, that challenge of the language that we use. So many things touch on aspects of magical practice, spiritual identity, religious identity. When we want to talk about these aspects of our lives that are often deeply personal, deeply meaningful, it makes it really hard to know what language do we use when we want to engage with these conversations. With your religious studies scholars hat on, talking to lay audiences, how do you like encourage people to navigate that?
What I tell people as a practitioner, like when I'm doing workshops, and what I tell people in classrooms too, is language is useful to a point. I will change to calling what I'm doing religion or practice or spirituality or whatever based on who I'm talking to all the time, because I feel like the important thing is being understood in that moment. But what I tell students and what I tell folks who interact with me in magical communities, is you are always, always better off just asking somebody, "What do you mean by that?" Right?
Yeah.
That's something that I've learned from my own mentors in magical spaces too. It just makes for a friendlier space instead of like having the most knee jerk, like bad faith kind of reaction to what somebody else says. It's worth it to just pause and go, "What do you mean by that?" Like when you say that witchcraft is this, or when you say that this thing over here is magic, like, can you tell me more? And then instead of trying to correct them, because I know the real answer or whatever, um, modifying your conversation such that you can still have a fruitful conversation. Because if I'm having a conversation with somebody and they're using the word spirituality, I have kind of a knee jerk reaction to that,
Mhm.
just because, like, one of the things I do in my scholarship, I study secularism and I study kind of the blurry spaces around, like, what's outside of religion. And one of the things that you figure out pretty quickly is that secularism is a political category and it
Right.
moves, right? We define different things as secular depending on who's in charge. So you can't be married to that. So folks who are really, really insistent about saying that they're, like, spiritual but not religious, for example, we can think that, like, oh, that's like a nuanced, unique perspective. Like, no, like, from a scholarly perspective, that comes from a place. Like, I can
Mhm.
make reasonable guesses about somebody's religious background if they tell me that they're spiritual but not religious,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And I'm not going to be right all the time, but, like, it gives me a hint, right? It's kind of like how you can hang out with somebody in the first 10 minutes, you can be like, oh, you grew up evangelical, didn't you? Right? And
Right.
there's just, like, little tells. We all come with baggage, whether we're practitioners or we're scholars. We show up to the table with assumptions and baggage, and a lot of that shows up in our language. So when somebody insists that something is a spirituality, right? Or it's an identity, oh, it's not a religion, I don't do this. It's much more efficient for me to just go, cool, totally. What do you think religion is so that I can, move around that?
And I think part of the thing that makes it tricky is that even within communities of practitioners, there is still that element of like, don't talk about sex, don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion.
Well, and when something's in the majority, it doesn't have to be religion or politics,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Like, we
Yep.
don't we don't go to work on Sundays. We don't think of that as a religious decision, but it is. Right? We don't
Right.
think of that as a political decision, but it is. The secular happens when Christianity becomes so invisible to us that we don't notice it.
Yeah. 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 I was talking with a friend about the podcast, and one of the things that I still get anxious about every single interview is, oh my gosh, I need to do right by this person.
Yeah,
And the thing that I've realized is that you can do background research and lit research and watch other interviews and things like that to try to do that kind of ethical work. Um, and invariably, you still mess up. I don't know, like doing ethnographic research, that's got to be like a really challenging but also rich space to kind of move through in terms of thinking about how do you get better at that kind of work, you
totally.
know?
Well, and I experienced this writing. I know you've been thinking about this a whole lot as you've been working on the podcast, but anytime you release a book, somebody's mad at you because
Mhm.
their thing isn't in it, or you didn't mention this one person, or I can't believe you didn't cite this book, or you completely overlooked this thing. The book is garbage, right? Like, that's going to happen no matter what you write. And you just have to do the best you can. I know that not every witch on the planet is going to love everything I say in this book. What I tried to do was be broad and inclusive enough to at least point people to better sources. So for example, I'm a white lady who spent most of her life operating in Wiccan spaces. I cannot talk about brujeria. Like, I just can't
Mhm.
do that. But what I can do is I can cite practitioners in those traditions and their own books. And I can point
Mhm.
people and go, here's who you need to read. Here's what I read. Here's some other, right? Like that. That's
Yeah.
something that was really important to me. So every chapter ends with additional resources, both from scholars. What are people in the academy? What do anthropologists say about this thing? But then there's also a section from witches, people calling themselves witches in various traditions of witchcraft, and their sources directly, because I think that's something that academic books often don't do. We have this
Mhm. Yeah.
tendency to only look at what the scholars are saying and to completely disregard primary sources, especially if those primary sources are, the popular books at Barnes and Noble. I also had practitioners from other traditions like reading my work,
Mhm.
and letting me know when and where I was wrong, right? So I could fix
Right, right.
things. And I'm not going to get everybody. You kind of just have to do the best you can and try to do better with each subsequent project. And I'm sure that will be true in my scholarship too, right? I've read dissertations. Most dissertations are real bad. I expect that mine will not be awesome, right? But like we'll publish something different later. That will be better. I promise I'll
Right.
get better as I get older
Yes.
and
Yes.
have more practice.
Did you have a particular person or people in mind when you were writing the book? Like, was there somebody you were sort of talking to in your head as you were writing?
I was very much envisioning somebody who is curious and smart. And just because you don't know a lot about witchcraft doesn't mean that you don't know a lot about other things. Everything is in context. I'm making the assumption that this person, they probably don't think that we're evil, right? Because they're not going to buy my book if they're just going to like throw it in a fire. That was something we were worried about in 1998, right? Like everybody had somebody whose mom threw their copy of Silver Ravenwolf into a fire somewhere. But I was thinking about like just smart, curious people who weren't afraid to learn about something different. When I was first in conversation with Llewellyn about this book, and it's different for Llewellyn, right? Llewellyn is not an academic publisher and it's not an academic book. And Llewellyn, something they do really well is like how-to guides, practitioner guides.
Right,
They want you on your way, right? Like
right.
rituals, spells, what next steps do you take? That's what they do, is they're there to help
Mhm.
practitioners. They're not necessarily thinking about like, what does the military chaplain need to know?
Right,
Right.
right.
I wanted something that you could give to a coworker without a lot of caveats and without having to be like, well, it's about Wicca. I'm not Wiccan, but it'll give you the idea. Like I didn't want to write from a Wiccan perspective either. So I also had to take my high priestess hat off. And that got weird too. So, you know,
Thorn Mooney, you're so amazing.
I appreciate you all. And I appreciate everybody who came.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with Thorn Mooney. Her book, Witches Among Us, comes out October 8th. And in the meantime, you can re-listen to Season 1, Episode 1, where Thorn is one of the featured speakers. In the meantime, we're hard at work on Season 3, and we'll have more about that for you soon. Take care.